So for my childhood, my mother sadly was an alcoholic. So I really didn't have a mother. She kept us safe, I would say, but she was British, she was removed, distant, had married at 18, didn't really know herself that well, and then was hit with this. She married a man that she didn't really know was going to be famous, of course, even though he was related to the Roosevelts. She arrived in this country at 18, and the first night out, she told me she sat next to Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice, at a dinner party.
Hello, you are listening to the Late Bloomer Living podcast, where we are reimagining and redefining what it means to be in midlife, where we are gathering energy, momentum, and excitement for our next chapter via candid conversations with other midlifers about their own pivots, pitfalls, and triumphs. I'm Yvonne Marchese, your host, and I'm so happy you're here. Family. It's a complicated word, isn't it? It's often romanticized in movies, songs, and commercials, and perhaps leaves us all feeling like our family is lacking in comparison. And here we are in the month of November. In America, that means we will soon be sitting down to dinner with our families for Thanksgiving dinner, and all the complexities of our families will suddenly be right in front of us. It can be challenging. And one of the most challenging relationships, perhaps, is the mother-daughter relationship. Today, I am so happy to bring you a story of a mother and daughter that leads to healing and forgiveness. Elizabeth Winthrop Alsop is the award-winning author of over 50 works of fiction for adults and children under the pen name Elizabeth Winthrop. Her latest book is titled Daughter of Spies, Wartime Secrets, Family Lies. Looking back on her life as her mother was slowly slipping away from her and into the mists of dementia, she's written a memoir for the first time. I sat down with her to talk about what it was like to write a memoir, to look deeply at her mother, and the events that made her who she was. I think we should just dive right in. So without further ado, here's Elizabeth Winthrop Alsop. Let's go. Hey, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with me today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Oh my
Thank
gosh.
you.
Oh my, yeah. Wow, you have a whole career behind you of novels.
Correct. Yes.
Right?
Fiction for children and adults. Picture books to 90-year-olds.
Wow.
But all fiction.
Wow. That's so cool. That's a wide swath of work.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah.
Before we get into your story, do you have
yeah.
a favorite format, like from picture book to...
I like to be working on more than one thing at once, so that if I'm writing a middle grade fantasy novel, which I was just doing, I'm also trying to write a picture book at the same time, because it draws from very different places. Picture books are very close to poetry. You have to get a lot said in a very short time. And often a picture book it's always 32 pages in print, but it might be 2 pages in manuscript form. So it's very different from writing a deep researched, character-driven novel. So I like to mix them both up, but I can't say that I like anything better than any other. I've written short stories, I've written poetry.
Yeah.
It's all writing to me.
Do you find, I'm getting really like in the weeds, but do you find that, let's say you're doing a picture book and a children's or a young adult novel, do you find that thematically you have echoing themes going across, crossing the stream between the two projects, or are they just two separate projects and you just need that kind of, like sometimes I'll be reading 4 books at a time that have nothing to do with each other, and I kind of need that.
Yes.
I don't know, I have a pinball brain, so.
Me too. I mean, I think that's much more, I think the only crossing might be in language. So if I am writing a picture book, I'm being very strict about, I write lots of stuff, but then I pull it way in. And then when I turn to the novel, I think, I don't need all these adverbs. Let the verb carry the sentence.
Mm.
So it's more writing techniques that might go back and forth or might inform one piece or the other rather than themes.
That is cool. Okay, so my mind just my brain just popped off my body. That is awesome.
Very
Very
funny.
cool. I love hearing about people's processes, so thanks for
Yeah.
indulging me.
Oh, I love talking about it. It's my favorite thing to talk about. Yeah.
Well, maybe that'll be our swing into talking about your memoir because that's like a whole other thing. And this is the first time you've written a memoir, right?
Correct.
And
Correct.
so, how old were you when you started the memoir?
I probably started it 10 years ago, so mid 60s, 62, 64. I started interviewing my mother much earlier than that, probably about 30 years ago. But
Oh,
I never thought of doing anything with it. I just thought, oh well, I should get Mummy's story, that sort of thing.
yeah.
And I had been doing that, and some of that was driven by the fact that I wrote a historical fiction, a novel called Counting on Grace. And it's about a little girl who works in a mill, a textile mill in Vermont in 1910. And her photograph was taken by the great child labor photographer, Lewis Hine. So I just went, I looked at her photograph, and I decided I'm writing a book, but I'm not using her story. I'm creating my own story. But
Wow.
after I finished the book, it just felt unfair not to know what happened to her. So I finished the book, it went into copy editing, and I said to my editor, hold the presses. I'm going to see if I can find her. So I did. I found her, she was dead, but met her granddaughter or great granddaughter. They didn't know her picture had been taken. It was an amazing side trip I
Oh
took.
my goodness.
Yeah, it was really moving.
I
And
bet.
then I came out of that and I thought, wait a minute, I know more about this little girl, Addie Card, than I know about my own mother. I don't know about her childhood. Yes, she grew up in Gibraltar, but what was that about? So that really spurred more of the interviewing. I ended up videotaping my mother twice. Once with her, she grew up in Gibraltar. She was born in 1926. Right at the age of 10, she witnessed the first battles of the Spanish Civil War from the roof of her parents' building. She went from one war to another, and she was in a British Crown colony, which is what Gibraltar is. It's sort of still a territory of Britain. And I put a photograph album in her lap that her father had made. And I videotaped her. And then I would get the camera to focus in on the picture. And there, all sorts of things came out,
Oh
all
my
sorts of
goodness, I
memories. It
bet.
was just like a well of deeply realized, rich, specific stories. She was a good storyteller. And she had been so quiet through the whole marriage that it was sort of like I knew I was getting to know another mother.
Oh my goodness. So how old would you estimate you were when you decided to do this with your mom, this videotaping of her with the
Um, my late 40s,
mm,
50s,
mm,
probably the videotaping late 50s. And when I did the first one on Gibraltar, then I did another one on World War II. What was it like to be bombed, Mommy? What was it like to have a miscarriage in the middle of a bombing raid? How
yeah.
did all those sorts of details. And again, somebody had finally given her the microphone. She'd been married to my father, a famous journalist who had the microphone for the whole
Mm-hmm.
marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the only girl. My mother was a Catholic, British Catholic, which is very odd. She conceived 12 children. She had seven of us. I have five brothers and one little sister who died at 3 months.
Mm.
And she had miscarriages, the other five. So it was just an amazing kind of experience in that she was juggling all these children My father traveled because he was a reporter for the Herald Tribune Syndicate, and he worked with his brother, his older brother, and they both agreed that 3 months of the year, each of them had to be out of the country. So Daddy would go to the Middle East or Moscow or, South America and be gone.
Wow.
And my mother had to run the whole show at home, and it really became too much in many ways. So for my childhood, my mother sadly was an alcoholic. So I really didn't have a mother. She kept us safe, I would say, but she was British, she was removed, distant, had married at 18, didn't really know herself that well, and then was hit with this. She married a man that she didn't really know was going to be famous, of course, even though he was related to the Roosevelts. She arrived in this country at 18. And the first night out, she told me she sat next to Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice, at a dinner party.
I read that and I just to imagine that. I think of
Amazing.
myself at 18 and how
Exactly.
completely naive I was and how much I didn't
Right.
know about myself, much less the world, and think
Exactly.
about that. And there was a big age difference between your mom and your
Yeah.
dad as well,
12
right?
years.
12
My mother
years.
was 18 when she married. My father was 30.
Wow.
And they met when she was 16 and five at a baronial castle in Yorkshire, England. And my father was in the British Army because the American Army had turned him down. So he enlisted with the British in the King's Royal Rifle Corps, a regiment. And he came to a party at the castle the last night before the castle was requisitioned by the Royal Canadian Air Force. And the owner of the castle was my mother's best friend's father. So Mummy was there for the summer. And 5 days later, he wrote a letter to his parents saying, "I've met the woman I'm going to marry. I know I've said this before, but this time it's really true." And I was stunning. She was 16. So she must have exuded a real sense of maturity, which
Mm.
she had, and he did not have that much. So he kind of realized he could depend on her. And that carried through the marriage because he left her to go on these reporting trips.
That's just, God, to think about how much of her lifetime was spent being pregnant
Exactly.
and alone.
And alone.
In
And alone.
not alone in the sense of I'm sure she's surrounded
Physically, we
by
were all.
kids, right? it's it's so interesting how they talk about loneliness is not about being alone.
No,
It's about feeling alone
a
in the
crowd.
midst of a crowd, and how
Exactly.
dangerous that is for us, for our health, for our mental health.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So she turned to the bottle, and she had a good friend, and they used to work at the emergency room in Children's Hospital, I think it was. And every this woman would bring her back to her house in the afternoon, and at 5 o'clock she'd say, let's have a drink. And my mother told me when she first heard this, she was shocked. You're not supposed to drink before the sun goes down, or over the
Mm,
yard arm, or whatever that line is. But she got used to it, and it showed her that she could medicate herself. She thought, tamp down the loneliness, distract herself from the loneliness. She never drank in public, never in front of us. She was a closeted alcoholic. So she had Coke, a Coca-Cola with vodka in it, because she thought
which
it didn't
struck
smell.
me in reading the book, and how mystifying her moods must have been for you, because you couldn't see
Mm-mm.
what was happening or what was really happening to me. And then on top of it, you're a kid, so you can't possibly at that age have understood the burden she was carrying
Not at all.
from
Not
all
at
the
all.
loss in her life.
No.
And so then that leaves you. I mean, what we make decisions, don't we, about ourselves
Yeah.
based on our childish brains and how they function, and like, wow.
Yeah, I think that for me, what it meant was I took on much too adult a role in the household. And my mother not only allowed it, but in some ways encouraged it because she knew she had to lock herself in that bedroom a lot of the time. So I was the kind of caretaker for my younger brothers. At one point, with my brother Nick, who's, I don't know, I can't quite remember, but about 7 or 10 years younger, I was that there were maids in the house when we always had staff, and they were on the third floor and they couldn't hear him crying. So I would go when he cried in the middle of the night and I would change the diaper or comfort him or
And you were how
and
old at this point?
I was probably about 11.
11.
And then my baby sister was born and I was in heaven because I had all these brothers. And she was born in January of 63, so I was about 13. And she died in March. And I changed her diaper the day she died and
And
went
it was
off
crib
to
death,
school. It
basically,
was crib
right?
death, sudden infant death.
I just
Yeah,
can't believe that we still haven't figured that out. I have
I
a
know.
friend whose grandchild recently
Mine,
passed.
me too. Yeah, I've had the
Horrible.
same. My cousin's daughter had
Mm,
had that situation.
mm.
So, on top of everything else, she's losing babies. And yet she's continues to be a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
We had fish on Fridays. We went to confession. We went to the 3-hour vigil on Good Friday. Etc. So my father was not Catholic, but my mother brought us all up Catholic, which he'd agreed to.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
but uh, it did make me really feel like I had to be in charge, particularly when my older two brothers went to boarding school, which they did in 1962. So there I was, 14 or whatever. They went even earlier, actually. They went in about 1960. So I had about 2 or 3 years at home where I was the oldest child in the house.
Wow.
And she just was struggling.
And I think about your story and that, you had staff, you guys went to
Hmm.
boarding school. You
Yeah,
you from the
we were
outside, I imagine people would
exactly,
look at your life and think you guys had it made, that
exactly.
there wasn't a problem in the world. There couldn't possibly be a problem in the world for your family based on
Hmm.
your political connections
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
wealth. Um,
Yeah.
it just goes to show that we all have struggles. It's a human condition.
Yeah. And you don't know what goes on behind the closed doors, no matter what it looks like outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was part of why I wrote the book in a way, because I thought this is, we do, a lot of children suffer from too rich parents, too absent parents, of course it's different than being poverty stricken and not knowing, having no food security. We had that.
Mm-hmm.
We had a shelter over our heads. But we didn't have the emotional component. And my father was also very distant. He was brought up in Connecticut. He was sort of an old WASP type. I say that when I kissed Daddy goodbye to go somewhere, the hair on his cheek electrified the hair on my cheek. That's how close, we brushed cheeks and that was it. Neither of my parents ever said, I love you, ever. It was too an emotional thing to say.
Wow.
Mommy called me love, and I knew she loved me, and I know my father did. But in a funny way, there were so many of us that we used to laugh that Daddy would look up from his chair in the corner of the living room trying to remember which one just went through or what my name was, or he kind of knew me because I was the only girl, but never birthdays, never remembered any of that, never. That he was too focused, and he had a really tough job. He had to be very focused.
Mm-hmm.
um, he had to produce a column 3 days a week. It's huge.
Yeah.
And he had a very overbearing brother, older brother. Uncle Joe had many wonderful qualities, but he was not easy to work with. And that, I think. And they were keeping secrets. The title of the book is Daughter of Spies, Wartime Secrets, Family Lies. And
Mm-hmm.
really, the family lies were what you didn't say to each other. part of what my premise is that my parents both, my mother was a decoding agent for MI5, the Secret Service in Britain. And at the age of 17, she was hired and she signed the Official Secrets Act. My father worked with the Office of Special Services, OSS, and he dropped behind enemy lines into France right after D-Day to liaison with the resistance. So she couldn't tell him what she did. He couldn't tell her where he was jumping. And that was a habit of secrecy that just extended into the family. So her drinking was secret. She kept it from him, she thought. Her mood changed so we could always tell. My Uncle Joe was a secret homosexual. He was caught in bed with a man in Moscow and harassed by the Soviets as well as by the CIA and the FBI, who found who he had to confess to. So there was a lot of this murky, ominous world that we grew up in. All of my father's best friends were CIA agents, all of them. I mean, he had other friends too, but they all, when you go down the list, it's shocking to see how they all, and many of them had come out of the war, had come out of the OSS like Daddy, and congregated in Washington. Because the excitement of the war, they didn't want to go back to being lawyers or doctors or whatever. They wanted that sense of excitement. So a lot of them became spies. It's just an eerie
Which makes
world.
me think about the whole thing of you writing a memoir to talk about this. Do you feel like it's your way of coming out from under keeping secrets?
Yes, absolutely. I had a therapist once who said, "You are a pariah in the family." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You spill the secrets." And that was before I wrote this. That was in fiction. You know, I wrote a novel called Knock Knock, Who's There? And it was about two boys whose father dies of a blood disease. And after he just dies, they discover their mother's an alcoholic. My father died of leukemia. I'm surrounded by brothers, you know. And when I published it, my brothers were terrified that Mommy would go back to drinking because she had gotten sober by then. But we had a very, very, very tough conversation around that book, as you can imagine. I mean, she felt exposed, and I said I had to write it. So
you talk about that in this memoir, and if I'm remembering correctly, it actually ended up helping you to heal your relationship with your mom, didn't it?
It did. It did help to heal it. She was in AA at the time, and she announced at a meeting that her daughter had written a book about her drinking. And she said, "I'm writing her a letter about how I feel about it." And one person asked her, "Well, where does your daughter live?" This was in Washington. She said, "You know, does your daughter live in Hong Kong or Japan or China? Where, you know?" Mommy said, "No, she lives in New York." And they said, "Well, why don't you go see her?" Of course, we hadn't had those kinds of conversations. And when she called me and said, "I'm coming up to see you to discuss the book," I said, "Do you have to? Couldn't you write me a letter?" I mean, you know, I was scared of that conversation.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine.
And
I can imagine the thumping.
Can you imagine your heart? And
yes.
I had two young children at that point, and there was no question that she was going to see the grandchildren. This was entirely about this. A friend of mine, my editor, lent me her apartment, and we met there. And we had a very, you know, a long truth session. And I learned a lot about how hard it was for her. And for example, she said to me, "You realize that time that you came down," and the only time in the 3 years of my father's illness that my mother got really drunk, the only time, the rest of the time she stayed off the bottle, which was pretty amazing because she was back and forth to National Institutes of Health. Daddy was up and down with the leukemia. And she said, "The only time I got really drunk was when I told him one morning that I had the stomach flu and I wasn't feeling well. And he said, 'Well, thank God you don't have leukemia.'" So there was no empathy there, and she just went and got the bottle. And you know, I had sympathy for all of this. He was not, I loved him, but he was not an easy man to live with, and he was very closed off in many ways. So that moment of us talking about that, at one point she said, I understood why you wrote the book. Why did you have to publish it? And I started to answer, and she said, never mind. I was married to a writer. I understand. So, it was, so when it came to writing this book, I told her that I was thinking of doing this as she was headed into dementia. She had dementia the last 4 years of her life. And she said, oh, you're writing my autobiography. And I didn't say, you have to write it. That's your auto, but I didn't say that. I just said, I'm telling your story, Mommy. It never got told. And that's what I feel about it. So.
And how did what did she say when, was she, it sounds like there might have been a little pride.
Yes.
With
in
her?
her, you mean?
Yeah, in her.
Yeah. I think she was very, I think she was very glad that I was bringing out what her life had been. She grows up in Gibraltar. Her older brother goes off to boarding school. She's basically alone. Here we go. Then she goes to boarding school. She meets her best friend and has a best friend there. Then she goes to meets Daddy at 16. But she tested high enough in the boarding school to be able to apply to Oxford, which shows you again.
Mm-hmm.
And her parents said, no, you have to do war work. So she was sent to a secretarial school. And from there, in March of 1943, she was 17. On her 17th birthday, she got a job in what she thought was the passport office. But she was taken upstairs, sat down by an colonel or somebody in the Navy, I can't remember his name, and said, sign the Official Secrets Act. She said, to work in the passport office? He said, you're not working in the passport office. You're working in the Secret Service with us. 17. The next day, she came out at the Queen Charlotte Ball, which was a debutante party that was quite famous in London. So, and then, worked there right till when she married my father in June of 44, in the middle of basically a bombing raid, a V-1 rocket raid. She gets pregnant. He goes to France. He jumps into France. She loses the baby. Again, we're now 18. He comes out after 3 months. They're together for 2 weeks. She gets pregnant again. And he goes back into France. He jumps again, comes back out. And she in order to get to America before the baby was 6 months in utero, you had to leave England or you'd be quarantined there for 2 years. That's why she had to get on that convoy, on that ship. So she's pregnant with my brother Joe. She gets on a ship. She goes out in convoy across the North Atlantic, dodging the U-boats. There are 7 women in a bunkroom and 1 8-year-old boy. He has German measles. He gives it to her. She's pregnant. He gives her German measles. She doesn't even know how dangerous that is. She never tells anybody. And lands in New York January 4th, 1945, not knowing a single soul. 18, pregnant.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
The courage of her.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's all what I learned when I wrote the memoir. All
it's amazing. I'm gonna speak for other people here, I guess, in saying this, but I do believe that we don't think of our parents as people, full-fledged people,
heroes,
who,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
incredible. And I wonder, for you doing this memoir later in life, after you've healed a relationship with your mom, what have you learned about yourself in doing this?
That's a really good question. I say about memoir, the real difference between memoir and fiction is memoir teaches you even more about yourself as the writer. What you focus on, what you don't want to look at, what you force, So, for example, in the first part of the book, I decided I couldn't just tell my parents' story because I wasn't there. And it was it fell flat on the page because it was just me telling what had happened. So I created what I call a braided narrative. And
Which I
so
love.
did you? Yeah.
Yes, very much so. So I'll let you explain what that is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that's all right. So when I really started writing, my mother was 82 and she was losing her mind. She was getting dementia. We don't know whether it was Alzheimer's or alcohol dementia because she did drink from the age of 16 to 51, and those brain cells don't come back. But I just decided that I would start moving back and forth in the part one of the book. I moved from taking care of her, having conversations with her, talking to the caregivers, talking to the doctor, to her walking into MI5 at the age of 17. So I went back and forth because her story came more alive when the reader knew me telling it in that present moment. But what was fascinating to me in looking back was when I hit part two, which was my childhood in Washington, growing up as a child of these two parents who had met and loved each other during the war and so on, courted during the war. I didn't want my mother in there at all. I did not want to go back and forth. I said, it's time for this little girl to get full coverage on the stage, get the spotlight. I don't want the reader empathizing with her because it was no fun growing up as the child of an alcoholic. I didn't know how deeply rooted those feelings were. I'd been through a 12-step program, I'd been in therapy, but still the sadness and abandonment of that little girl was what came up to me in writing part two. And so I gave little Elizabeth the full stage, the spotlight. I'd only talked about that childhood through my experience. Then when I came to part three, it was like I had cleared that out of my system. I had come to realize how brave my mother had been, how stalwart. And in the years from when she stopped drinking to dementia was 30 years. She stopped at 51 and she started to go into dementia at 82. She had helped me. Helped me through a very difficult divorce, gotten to know my children, become a grandmother who was present, et cetera, et cetera. So I was so sad when I began to lose her again with the dementia.
Hard process. Yeah.
It's so hard. And
My
it
father has
triggered,
dementia.
really.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it triggered a childhood, some odd childhood feelings. For example, when I saw her impatient or snapping at the caregivers, I felt like I had to rush and protect them the way I had protected my little brothers when she had been drinking. So it resembled in a funny way, or it triggered the childhood emotions of her drinking. But it also, what it did for me was, it was a way to reach her during the dementia. I would read her letters Daddy had written to his parents about what a beautiful woman she was or what young girl she was. And she would laugh and say, I never read those letters. Or she would say to me, here's a perfect example. She would say to me, I can't read anymore. There's something wrong with my eyes. We had them checked. There was nothing wrong with her eyes. She couldn't remember the end of the sentence by the beginning, by the time she got to it. Couldn't remember the beginning of the sentence. And so at one point I went down in the basement and I found all these documents from Gibraltar. And one of them was a military commission for my great uncle, her uncle. I handed it to her. I said, Mommy, read this. It's so funny. And it had all the S's and kind of strange things. She read the whole thing from beginning to end.
Unbelievable. Isn't that crazy? It is a crazy disease.
It's a crazy disease. You never know. You never know. She could still play bridge.
Yeah,
How
the moments
could she remember whose points were in which cards? I could not believe she could. And I said that to her and she said, well, it's a habit. Well, it isn't. It's a memory. The things that she could do. I sent a woman in at one point to just, get her story and be with her, sit with her companion, because I did not live in Washington. I went down all the time, And this woman wrote me and she said, I gave your mother one long word and I asked her to get all the words out of those letters that she could. She said she got 54 words. She said,
What?
I have never seen anything like this.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, it was really incredible. And the videotapes were terrific. I played her music from World War II, Vera Lynn, all those sort of
Music has a
romantic
way
songs.
of cutting through, doesn't
It
it?
does. It does.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was great. I read her the letters. I got her to read documents. And then what I found with the videos is that she would watch them and she would come up with another detail. Oh, I
Mm.
remember that. We were standing on the balcony of the Ritz during the honeymoon, and the B-1 rockets were coming over into Green Park. And I turned around, and your father was hiding under the stairs. And I wore a black dress. He was the soldier, she said, but I'm the one out there looking at the V1. So, and of course, she'd lived in London where they were shooting the V1s. He was training up in north part of England, so he'd never experienced the rockets before. So
Wow.
those details would still come out. And it was a wonderful thing to do. I was so lucky that I'd done the videotapes before she got dementia, because she watched those hour after hour. She loved to watch those videotapes. And when we ran out of conversation, we put them back on again.
Hmm.
It was fascinating. The other thing I did was I traveled to all the places she'd lived. So when I went to Gibraltar, I found, her childhood house, this place she stood when her great-grandfather was knighted by the Duke of Cornwall, blah, blah, blah. And I made a picture book for her. She picked that up 3 times a day because
Wow.
she didn't remember reading it, looking, and there was no words, it was just pictures. And it was like giving her a path back into that childhood where she had left so much behind. Yeah, I was lucky there that I'd figured some of those things out.
Yeah, boy. It sounds like it's just been an incredible healing process for you.
It has. Incredible. And particularly the very end, that postcard she threw me from the grave, as I like to say,
Oh,
where after she died, I went through her papers, and my mother had been very instrumental in bringing hospice to America because it was an English program, and she really believed in it. And she gave a speech to a group of people about hospice, and she told her own story. Now, she never said in that speech, I was drunk, but she said, I totally fell apart after my husband died and what that felt like and so on. And I came away saying, not only did she lead a self-examined life, which I didn't think she had, but she was also a great storyteller. So the notes for that speech just gave me a whole nother dimension of my mother that I had not realized. So yes, thank you for saying that. It was a real healing process. And I don't think writing memoir always is. It can really expose some dark, dark things that are hard to heal, but it did for me.
yeah. Where
Yeah.
where do you see yourself going next with your writing? Um, like, where has it left you now? Like, as far
Hmm.
as, I guess, self exploration, you know, do you feel like that's done now and you can move forward and
Yeah. I feel that it's a closure. I feel it's a present, a gift to her because her story is told. I got the microphone away from my father and, I got it in front of her. I came away saying, I understand why she turned to drink. You're never supposed to have an excuse, but my Lord, she had a lot of them, a lot of reasons too. I think she was, as we discussed, far lonelier than I ever knew as a child. Um, so I've come full circle. I don't intend to write another memoir. I have just finished a novel. I have a sort of what they call a children's classic. I have a middle grade fantasy series called The Castle in the Attic and The Battle for the Castle. And I've just written a prequel, which I'm calling for the moment The Cradle in the Castle. So that feels wonderful. I can see there's possibly another book in that series. I've had two readers who I trust read it, and one of them, who normally is very good at editing and stuff, she said, I lost all critical distance. She said, I just was swallowed by the story, which is what a writer wants to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think the memoir deepened this book because it's a time travel book, which the other two are also. But I set it on the northeast coast of England, kind of in honor, and the castle has always been in England, but I set it very specifically in a place. And I opened the book in 1943 when everybody thought the Germans were going to invade England in exactly that area. And so that history in the war informs the entire book, informs what the boy decides to do, why he runs away from his present time into the past, etc. So there is that English side of me. I'm in fact half English, half British. So
yeah,
it really it informed this book more than any other.
Wow. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. Now the book is out and available now, right?
October 25th.
October 25th. So by the time people hear this, it will be available. And it's Daughter of Spies, Wartime Secrets, Family Lies, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. And I will have in the show notes, I'll have a link to where people can find it and learn more about you. Is there anything else coming up that you're excited? I mean, you've got the prequel for the novel. Anything else coming up?
I'm excited about the tour for this book because it's really, I'm getting to speak at Politics and Prose in Washington. So that's, dead center.
Wow. Back to where it all started. Yeah. Oh my goodness. And so, and interesting too, that book tours are happening again, right?
They are, we hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah.
I'm also going to Middletown, Connecticut, where my mother and father are buried, and my father's entire family comes from Middletown. So I'm speaking at a bookstore, but in conjunction with the Middlesex County Historical Society.
Wow.
So the conversationalist is going to take me back. The other fun thing I'm doing is I'm speaking here at a private New York library, but it's open to the public, and there is a Zoom. And it's a conversation with Tim Gunn. So do you know who Tim Gunn is?
Yeah. Right. How did that happen?
That's very funny. He lives down the block from me, and we met at a diner. And I say to people, I said to my favorite waitress in the diner, Stephanie, I said, who is that man who comes in here dressed to the nines every week? She said, well, that's Tim Gunn. And I said, well, who's Tim Gunn? She just roared. She couldn't believe it because I had never watched Project Runway or anything. He loves that I've never watched any of that. But the interesting thing...
I bet that's refreshing for him. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is we grew up the same way. His father was number 2 to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI.
Wow.
His mother was a librarian at the CIA. He went to the same elementary school as I did. He's younger. He was in my younger brother's class. He grew up 5 blocks from me. And we share this same murky underworld. You can imagine what his father was doing and carrying, what secrets he had.
Oh my goodness.
And we like to say that his father probably wrote the report on my uncle when my uncle was discovered in bed with the man in Moscow. The KGB set him up in a compromat. So that there's lots to talk about there.
Wow. Yeah.
So
when is that happening? And is that a link that if it's already happened by the time this comes out, will it still be something people could watch?
Yeah, it's November 14th. So it's quite far after this book comes out. And it's at 6:00, and people there's a live link for you to attend, or there's a Zoom link.
Okay.
I can send you those.
I think that will still be upcoming because I'm looking at putting this out for you early November.
Perfect.
So that should work out really well. And I'll be sure to put that in the show notes for anybody who wants to go watch that. That's very
So,
exciting.
what a
I will do my best
conversation.
to be there. That's very cool.
Yeah. I will.
Yeah.
Does it help if I send you the links for that?
It would be very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so I can just
Terrific.
respond to one of the emails you sent me, right?
Yeah, that sounds
Okay.
great. Any links you think would be helpful would be,
Okay.
I'd be happy to include them. So,
Okay. Great.
oh my goodness, Elizabeth, it's been a complete and total pleasure to talk to you, to hear your story. Thank you for being so open, not only in this conversation, but in the book. I was very moved by your story, your mother's story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It means a lot to me to be able to talk to someone who understands the way you do.
Yeah.
So
I'm just
appreciate
always
it.
hopeful for us as humans that
Hmm.
healing is always possible
Yeah, it
at
is.
any age.
It is. And this book definitely is healing, as you pointed out. Yeah. Yeah, I feel at peace now with my mother. I told her story. We did the hard work and we got to the end. And so the closure when she died was so much more, wasn't easy, but it was more satisfying and authentic when I lost her. So I think that's really important too. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm, it feels strange to say I'm happy for you,
No,
but
I think that's appropriate. Yeah,
yeah,
good.
yeah.
I'm happy for me too.
Thank you
Great
again.
to, great to meet you.
Great to meet you too.
Take care.
Well, there you have it. I'm so thrilled that I had the chance to sit and talk to Elizabeth. I found her story to be very hopeful, and her book was a really good read, by the way. So I recommend it if you're looking for some holiday reading, and it's hot off the presses. It was just released on October 25th. So she's in the middle of a book tour and has some events coming up in the next couple of weeks that you might be able to attend if you're in Washington, D.C. or Middlesex, Connecticut. Oh, and this is cool. She will make an appearance with Tim Gunn of Project Runway fame that will be live in New York on November 14th. But that's also going to be available to watch online if you're not in New York. How cool is that? I will have information about her book tour in the show notes for this episode. You can go to latebloomerliving.com/podcast and click on the link for episode 116. If you want to have a copy of her book, I will have a link for that also. Hey, before I go, I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention to you that next Tuesday, November 8th at 9 o'clock Eastern Time is the next gathering for the Midlife Uprising community. That's a group of women who are ready to make waves as we age. And man, we have fun in there. You can check it out at midlifeuprising.com. I hope to see you there. Thank you. Really, truly thank you for listening. It's November. I'm feeling very grateful. I feel grateful lots of times, but your time is valuable. And here you are at the end, still listening. Wow, you're blowing me away. Thank you. I hope you have a fantastic week. Stay safe and well. Talk soon.